The Duke of Alastair did not consider his marriage a matter of the heart. It was a matter of ledgers and lineage, a transaction as clean and cold as the striking of a deed. The Vaunt's debts were considerable, a blight upon a respectable name, and the Duke possessed the means to eradicate them. In return, he would receive Miss Eleanor Vance, a young woman of suitable breeding, unremarkable history, and, most importantly, a constitution that promised the efficient production of an heir. He had met her precisely twice. On both occasions, she had been as still and silent as the porcelain figurines that populated his mother's forgotten drawing room. He found this stillness acceptable. It suggested a lack of complication. Lord Vance, her cousin and guardian, a man whose florid face spoke of too much port and too little sense, had presented her with the oily pride of a horse trader. A quiet girl, your grace, biddable, knows her place. Alastair had merely inclined his head, his gaze assessing Eleanor not as a woman, but as a solution to a logistical problem. She was pale and slender, with hair the color of dried honey and eyes of a shade he could not immediately name. Not blue, not gray, but something indeterminate in the watery London light. She wore a dress of plain muslin that seemed to absorb the room's sparse warmth, rendering her almost invisible against the damask wallpaper. She did not speak unless spoken to, and when she did, her voice was low and even, a thread of sound so fine he feared it might snap. The contract was signed. The debts were settled. The date for the wedding was set. It was all remarkably efficient. That evening, in the masculine confines of his club, Alastair had penned a letter to his friend, Lord Ashworth, a man who shared his pragmatic view of the world. Ashworth had inquired about the future Duchess. Alastair, swirling a glass of brandy and feeling the satisfying weight of a problem solved, had written his assessment with clinical detachment. He described the arrangement, the girl's quiet demeanor, her suitable, if uninspiring, pedigree. He ended the draft with a flourish of cynical prophecy, a line born of arrogance and the deep-seated belief that anything so quiet must also be fragile. "You asked if she would suit," he wrote. "She is precisely as expected. Quiet, biddable, utterly unremarkable. She will wilt within a season, I'm sure, but by then I should have my heir." He had blotted the ink, folded the draft, and left it on his desk to be copied and sent in the morning. He gave it no more thought than he would a note to his tailor. It was an opinion, a passing observation, a thing of no consequence. 3 weeks later, she was his wife, the Duchess of Alastair. The journey to Blackwood Manor, his primary seat, was conducted in a silence that was dense and weighty. He had expected it, and yet it was of a different quality than he had imagined. It was not the empty silence of a vacant room, but the watchful silence of a forest. He would occasionally glance at her, seated opposite him in the carriage. She looked out the window, her gaze fixed on the blur of greens and browns. Her hands, gloved in pale gray kid, were folded in her lap. She was a study in stillness, a creature of perfect composure. He mistook it for simplicity. He mistook it for a lack of inner life. He made a perfunctory attempt at conversation. "The lands are fertile through this part of the country." "Yes, your grace," she had replied, her eyes never leaving the landscape. "The soil appears to be a rich loam." Loam. It was a practical, earthy word. It was not the sort of word he had expected. He had anticipated a simple agreement, perhaps a comment on the beauty of the scenery. The precision of her vocabulary was a minor, dissonant note in the symphony of mediocrity he had composed for her in his mind. He dismissed it. Blackwood Manor was a vast, Gothic masterpiece of stone and shadow, a place that had long been run with masculine efficiency and little warmth. His late mother had been a woman of fragile nerves who had retreated from its management, and Alistair had been content to let it function as a well-oiled machine, serviced by stewards and secretaries. Upon their arrival, the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was a roadmap of disapproving loyalties, greeted them with a stiff curtsy. Eleanor, now the Duchess, inclined her head. She did not offer a nervous smile or a flurry of questions. She simply looked, her gaze sweeping over the cavernous hall, the dark wood, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Her observation was so complete, so quiet, that it felt like an act of absorption. She was taking the measure of the place. That first week, she was a ghost in his house. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. He would find her in the library, not reading, but simply standing before a shelf, her head tilted as if listening to the books. He would see her in the gardens, her fingers tracing the petals of a frost-bitten rose. She performed her duties as Duchess with a quiet competence that was, in itself, unnerving. She met with Mrs. Gable, reviewed the menus, approved the linens. There were no complaints, no suggestions, no personal touches. She was a custodian, not a mistress. He found himself faintly irritated by her placidity. He had wanted a duchess who would not cause trouble, and he had gotten one. But he had not anticipated that her lack of trouble would manifest as a lack of presence. It was like living with a beautiful, silent automaton. The first crack in his perception came on a Tuesday. He had been wrestling for months with the estate accounts. His steward, a man named Fletcher, was competent but overwhelmed. The ledgers were a labyrinth of inconsistencies, small discrepancies that hinted at a larger problem he could not quite pinpoint. Frustrated, he had left the books spread across the great oak desk in his study, the columns of figures mocking him with their subtle chaos. He had retired late. The next morning, he entered his study to find the ledgers neatly stacked. On top of the stack was a single sheet of paper. On it, in a small, precise hand, was a list of dates, figures, and page numbers. At the bottom, a single sentence was written. The price of grain from the North Quadrant has been inflated by 3% on these 17 occasions, always on the last Friday of the month, corresponding with payments to a shipping concern that does not exist. He stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He opened the top ledger. He turned to the pages she had indicated. He followed the trail of her immaculate notations. It was all there, a pattern of meticulous, long-term embezzlement. So subtle it had evaded auditors for years, she had unpicked it in a single night. He looked at the note again. There was no triumph in it. No, I told you so. It was a simple statement of fact, an equation solved. He did not go to her. He did not thank her. He summoned Fletcher and, using Eleanor's note as a script, dismantled the man's career with surgical precision. The matter was handled. But the image of that neat, handwritten note remained imprinted on his mind. He had acquired a duchess. He had not realized he had acquired a mind sharper than his own. It was an unsettling thought. He began to watch her. Not as a husband watches a wife, but as a scientist observes a strange, new specimen. He noticed things. She played the pianoforte. She never played when he was in the room, but in the evenings, a soft, melancholic music would drift up from the drawing room. It was complex, intricate music he did not recognize. The moment she heard his footsteps approaching, the music would cease. By the time he entered the room, She would be sitting with a book in her lap, her hands still. She had a dry wit, as sharp and unexpected as a shard of glass. One evening, at a stilted dinner, he had been complaining about a tedious political debate in the House of Lords. "It is a battle of peacocks," he declared, "all display and no substance." From across the long, polished table, she had murmured without looking up from her plate, "Peacocks are at least beautiful to look at, Your Grace. One cannot say the same for most of Parliament." The footman nearly dropped a serving dish. Alistair had stared at her, momentarily speechless. A smile had almost touched his lips. It was the first time. He had recalibrated his assessment of her. She was not simple. She was contained. There was a vast, hidden world behind those quiet, indeterminate eyes. This new knowledge did not soften him. Instead, it pricked at his pride. He had made a bargain for a simple commodity, and he felt obscurely cheated to discover it was something far more complex. The transaction felt tainted, the terms unclear. It was this lingering sense of disquiet that made him careless. 2 months into their marriage, the letter from Ashworth arrived. It was a letter of jocular congratulations, filled with the usual gossip and political speculation. At the end, Ashworth had written, "And how fares the little mouse you have installed at Blackwood? Has she proven a satisfactory purchase?" Alistair had snorted at the question, his pride stung by the mercantile term. He sat at his desk to pen a reply. He wanted to convey that he was in complete control of the situation, that his choice had been a sound one. He wrote of her efficiency, her unexpected grasp of accounts. But his arrogance, that deep, unexamined core of his character, needed to assert its dominance. He needed to re-establish her as the lesser party in their arrangement. He dipped his pen in the ink. He did not even think. The words flowed from a place of ingrained privilege. He repeated the sentiment from his first letter, embellishing it slightly. "She is proving more useful than anticipated," he wrote. "The household runs like a clock, and she has a mind for figures. But do not mistake utility for vitality. The quietness I spoke of is a fixed state. She is a creature of shadow, not sun. She will wilt within a season. It is inevitable." He left the draft on his desk while he went to consult a map of his Scottish estates. He was gone for perhaps an hour. When he returned, the letter was precisely where he had left it. He thought nothing of it. Eleanor had developed a quiet routine of her own. In the afternoons, when the Duke was occupied with his estate manager or his correspondence, she would move through the house, her purpose to bring a subtle order to its grand, impersonal spaces. She did not change things so much as settle them. It was during this quiet tour that she entered his study. It was not a trespass. He had told her she was welcome there. The library and study were at her disposal. She saw the letter on his desk. It was the untidiness of it that drew her eye, the slight curl of the paper, the dark slash of ink. Her intention was merely to straighten it, to place a paperweight upon it. But her own name, written in the Duke's strong, decisive hand, leapt out at her. And then, the words of Lord Ashworth. The little mouse. Satisfactory purchase. A cold stillness, far deeper than her usual composure, settled into her bones. Her gaze moved to the Duke's reply, to the draft lying beside the incoming letter. She read it. She read it twice. A creature of shadow, not sun. She will wilt within a season. The words did not provoke tears. Tears were a luxury she had learned long ago she could not afford. They were a sign of a wound, and she had learned to bear her wounds in silence. Instead, the words acted as a key. turning a lock deep inside her. It was the confirmation of a truth she had always suspected. She was not a person to him. She was an object, a temporary one, a flower bought from a stall, expected to fade and be discarded once its brief purpose was served. Very carefully, with fingers that did not tremble, she picked up the draft. She folded it once, then twice, the creases sharp and exact. She did not crumple it. She did not tear it. To do so would be an act of passion, an admission of pain. She would give him neither. She slipped the folded paper into the sleeve of her dress, a small, square weight against her skin. Then she turned and left the study, closing the door so softly behind her that it made no sound at all. The Duke of Alastair did not notice the change at first. Life, on the surface, continued its placid course. The dinners were served on time. His linens were always clean. The household accounts, now under her discreet purview, were balanced to the penny. He was, by all measures, a man whose domestic life was in perfect order. But perfection has a chill to it. It began with the music. The evenings at Blackwood grew heavier, weighed down by a profound silence. The pianoforte in the drawing room remained closed. Its polished surface gathered a thin film of dust, a testament to its disuse. He found himself waiting for the soft, melancholic melodies that had once drifted through the halls, and their absence was a palpable void. He once asked her, "You no longer play?" "I have not felt the inclination, Your Grace," she replied, her voice a smooth, flat stone, skipping over the surface of the question without disturbing the depths. Then came the flowers. She had always kept a small vase on his desk, filled with whatever was blooming in the gardens or the hedgerows, a sprig of lavender, a cluster of wildflowers, a single, defiant rose. It was a small, almost imperceptible touch of life in his austere study. He had never acknowledged it, but he had grown accustomed to it. One day, the vase was gone. The space where it had sat seemed unnaturally bare. The room felt darker somehow. Her physical presence began to alter. She was still there, in her chair at the opposite end of the long dining table, but she seemed to have receded into herself. She had become a watercolor painting left out in the rain, her colors muted, her edges blurred. When he spoke to her, her eyes would meet his for a flicker of a second, but it was like looking at a shuttered window. There was no one home. He was a man who noticed details. It was what made him a formidable landowner and politician. And so, he began to catalog the small, accumulating clues of her retreat. The way she no longer walked in the gardens, but confined herself to the house. The untouched book that lay on her bedside table, its marker never moving from the same page. The way she now spoke only to the staff, her voice, when directed at him, reduced to the barest minimum of social necessity. "Yes. No. As you wish, Your Grace." He found it infuriating. He had married her for her quietness, and now that quietness had become a weapon, a form of passive resistance so subtle he could not call it out without sounding like a madman. How does one command a person to be present? How does one demand a soul to return to a body? He tried to breach the wall. He brought her a gift, a first edition of a botanical text he had seen her looking at in the library catalog. He presented it to her in the drawing room, the silence between them thick as velvet. She accepted it with a cool grace. "Thank you, Your Grace. You are very kind." She placed the book on a side table. She never opened it. The house began to feel like his tomb. It was orderly. It was grand. It was silent. It was exactly as it had been before she arrived. And he discovered, to his profound shock, that he hated it. He had not realized that her quiet presence had been a form of life, her soft music, her wildflowers, the rare, dry spark of her wit. They had been like threads of ivy, slowly, imperceptibly creeping over the cold stone of his existence, bringing with them a hint of color and life. Now, the ivy had withered. One afternoon, he was with his estate manager, Mr. Hobbs, a man who had served the estate for 40 years and whose loyalty was to the land itself, not necessarily to its master. Hobbs was a man of few words, but his observations were always acute. Alistair, in a moment of uncharacteristic frustration, found himself complaining. "The Duchess is unwell," he said, searching for a word that did not sound like an accusation. "She has grown melancholy." Hobbs finished noting a figure in his ledger before he looked up. His eyes, pale and shrewd, met the Duke's. "Is she, Your Grace, or is she merely in a state of careful preservation?" Alistair frowned. "What do you mean by that, Hobbs?" Hobbs blotted the ink on his page with deliberate slowness. "I have observed Her Grace with the tenants. She listens to them. I have seen her redesign the crop rotation for the West Fields on a scrap of paper, and her design is superior to the one we have used for a century. I have seen her teach the baker's boy to read. These do not seem the actions of a melancholy woman." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Perhaps, Your Grace. The climate at Blackwood does not agree with a flower you expected to wilt." "Wilt!" The word struck him like a physical blow. It was so specific, so utterly, damningly familiar. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, began to seep into him. He stared at Hobbs, but the old man had already returned to his ledgers, his face impassive. He left the estate office abruptly, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He walked back to the house, the single word echoing in his mind. Wilt. 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 It was a word he had written, a word he had thought private. He stormed into his study, a place that now felt alien and hostile. He went to his desk, his hands shaking as he rifled through the drawers. He kept drafts of important letters. It was his habit. He found the folder for his correspondence with Ashworth. He pulled out the copy of the letter he had sent 2 months ago. And there it was, the black ink on the cream paper, a snake coiled in the grass. "She will wilt within a season." He sank into his chair, the letter clutched in his fist. He remembered everything, leaving the draft on his desk, his hour-long absence, her quiet, unobtrusive tidying. He had assumed she was a simple creature, incapable of guile or deep feeling. He had believed her mind was as plain as her dresses. He saw now, with a clarity that was excruciating, the depth of his error. He had not just insulted her, he had rendered a verdict. He had sentenced her to obsolescence. He had defined her worth and found it temporary. And she had seen it. She had read his casual, cruel dismissal of her very being. He thought of her silence, her retreat, the emptiness in her eyes. It was not melancholy. It was a profound, logical, and utterly justified withdrawal. She had discovered the foundation of their marriage was not merely transactional, but built upon his contempt. And she had responded not with hysterics, but with the quiet, dignified removal of her soul from the arrangement. She had fulfilled the letter of her contract. She was his duchess. She ran his house, but she had rescinded the spirit. He looked down at the letter in his hand, a testament to his own monumental foolishness, his arrogance, his blindness. He had possessed something of rare and quiet value, and he had not even known it. He had looked at a diamond and seen only a piece of glass. The epiphany was not a gentle dawning. It was a violent shattering. All his certainties, his carefully constructed view of himself as a logical, rational man, fell away. He saw himself as she must see him, a callous, arrogant fool, a man who would write such a thing about his own wife. He had to find her. He had to— What? Apologize? The word seemed pathetically inadequate. How could he apologize for the very structure of his soul? But he had to do something. The silence in his house was no longer a mere absence of sound. It was the sound of his own failure. He searched the house first. The library, the drawing room, her chambers. They were all empty, imbued with her phantom presence but devoid of her person. Mrs. Gable, when he asked, informed him that the Duchess often walked towards the old glass houses, a section of the estate that had been neglected for decades. He found her there. The glass houses were skeletal remains, their panes clouded with grime or shattered, allowing the wind to whisper through. In the largest of them, amidst the decay and the debris, Eleanor had cleared a small space. She had set up a potting bench. On it, and on the surrounding shelves, were dozens of orchids, their strange, waxy leaves looking alien in the pale English light. They were all in various states of distress, spotted, withered, struggling. She was tending to one, her touch infinitely gentle as she cleaned a diseased leaf with a soft cloth. She was trying to save things that everyone else had abandoned. He stood in the doorway, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the overgrown turf. She did not look up, but he knew she was aware of him. The line of her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on fallen glass. He stopped a few feet away, the decaying scent of wet earth and dying plants filling his lungs. He held out the folded letter. It was not the copy. He had found the original draft, tucked away in a small box on her dressing table, folded into a tiny, hard square. She had kept it. The knowledge was a knife in his gut. "I found this," he said. His voice was rough, unfamiliar to his own ears. She finally looked up. Her eyes were not gray, he realized. They were the color of a winter sea, deep and churning with currents he could not read. There was no surprise in them, only a profound, weary stillness. "I was wrong," he said. The words felt small, absurdly insufficient for the magnitude of his crime. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I wrote this before I knew you, before I saw you." He took a step closer. "I looked at you, and I saw what I expected to see. A convenience, a name on a contract. I did not see a woman who could unravel years of theft in a single night. I did not hear a woman whose wit could silence a room. I did not see a person who could bring life to this house with nothing more than a vase of flowers and a few notes of music." He gestured around the ruined glass house at the collection of dying plants. "You come here to save these. But the house has become like this since you left it. It is empty. It is cold. My life is cold without you in it. Not your function as a duchess. You." He paused, forcing himself to meet her unwavering gaze. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I have no right to it. I am here only to confess my own blindness, to tell you that the man who wrote that letter was an idiot, and he is ashamed. To prove his words were not merely air, he had taken action before seeking her out. I have written to your cousin," he continued, his voice low and steady. "I informed him that the final payment of his debts is indefinitely suspended. It will be released only when he has sent you a written apology for treating you as a piece of property to be sold. He took another breath. I have also dismissed Fletcher's replacement. I told Mr. Hobbs that all estate accounts are to be submitted to you for final approval. Your authority in that matter is now absolute and public. He was dismantling the transaction. He was trying to show her that he was tearing up the old contract and begging for the chance to write a new one. Eleanor listened, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, broken only by the sighing of the wind through the broken panes. She looked from his face to the letter in his hand, then back again. For a moment he thought she would simply turn back to her orchids, leaving him to stand there amidst the ruins of his own making. But then she spoke, and her voice, though quiet, was not flat. It was edged with something hard and clear, like ice. Words are easily written, Your Grace, she said. You wrote them then, and you speak them now. You saw me as a season. A season is 3 months. It is 90 days. She looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time he saw not emptiness, but a flicker of fire in their depths. A season is a long time. It is time enough to see if a plant will grow, or if the soil is poison. She did not take the letter from him. She did not rage or weep. She simply stated the terms of her new reality. He had set a time frame. She would hold him to it. She was not offering forgiveness. She was offering probation. With that, she turned back to her ailing orchid, her attention absolute, her dismissal of him complete. He was left standing there, understanding that his atonement would not be a matter of a single grand gesture, but a slow, painstaking process of earning back the light he had so carelessly extinguished. He had to prove the soil was no longer poison. The season that followed was a long and quiet autumn. Alistair began the painstaking work of learning a new language, the language of attention. He did not press her for conversation or demand her company. Instead, he started to observe her with the same intensity she had once applied to his house, but his purpose was not assessment. It was understanding. He learned that she preferred tea to coffee, that she read history, but not novels, that the music she played was by a little-known Viennese composer whose work was considered unfashionably complex. He learned that the slight frown that appeared between her brows when she was concentrating was a sign of deep engagement, not displeasure. He learned that she had a particular fondness for the scent of rain on dry earth. He did not present these observations as gifts or as proof of his change. He simply acted upon them. One morning, a crate arrived from London containing every published score by her preferred Viennese composer. He left it in the drawing room without a word. For 3 days, it sat untouched. On the 4th evening, as he sat in his study, he heard it. The soft, hesitant notes of the pianoforte, drifting through the house for the first time in months. He did not go to her. He simply sat in the darkness and listened. He made the glass house his project. He hired stonemasons to repair the foundations and glaziers to replace every broken pane of glass. He did not consult her on the design. He simply had it restored to its original Victorian glory. When it was done, he had a small stove installed to keep the winter chill at bay. He did not announce its completion. She discovered it for herself one afternoon. He watched from his study window as she stood in the doorway of the glittering, warm structure, her hand resting on the new wood of the doorframe. She stayed there for a long time before finally stepping inside. The rebuilding was not a linear process. There were days of profound, disheartening silence, days when her reserve felt as impenetrable as the walls of Blackwood itself. During these times, He would feel the familiar sting of his own pride, the urge to demand a response, to force a resolution. But he would remember the look in her eyes in the ruined glasshouse, and he would master the impulse. He was learning the difficult art of patience. He was learning that trust, once shattered, had to be regrown from the root, and it was a slow, delicate process. Section. Her cousin, Lord Vance, provided an unexpected catalyst. He arrived one morning, unannounced, his face a mask of purple fury. He stormed into Alistair's study, brandishing the Duke's letter. "What is the meaning of this, Alistair? Holding my funds hostage? And for what?" A scribbled apology to a girl who should be on her knees in gratitude. Alistair rose slowly from his desk. A year ago, he would have handled this with cold, political maneuvering. But something had changed in him. The insult to Eleanor felt personal, a violation. "The meaning is precisely as stated, Vance. You will write the apology. You will acknowledge that you treated your own kin, now the Duchess of Alistair, as chattel, and you will do it with sincerity. Or you will find that your creditors are suddenly far less patient than I have been." "She is your wife, a piece of property you acquired," Vance sputtered. At that moment, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. She stood there, silent and watching. Vance saw her and sneered. "There she is now, the little mouse. Tell me, girl, has he tired of you already? Is that the problem?" A cold, quiet rage, unlike anything he had ever known, settled over Alistair. He walked around his desk until he was standing directly in front of Vance, his height and presence suddenly menacing. "Lord Vance," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "the woman you are addressing is the Duchess. She is the mistress of this house. She is my wife, and she possesses more intelligence in her little finger than you have in your entire, worthless body. You will apologize to her now, or my footman will throw you into the horse trough." Vance paled, his blustering rage deflating in the face of Alistair's cold fury. He looked from the Duke to the silent woman in the doorway. He saw no weakness there, only a calm, assessing strength that unnerved him. He mumbled a hasty, insincere apology, bowed stiffly, and practically fled the room. Alistair turned to Eleanor. The anger drained away, replaced by a raw vulnerability. He had defended her. He had defended her not as his possession, but as a person of worth. He waited for her reaction. She looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, the shutters behind her eyes seemed to part. She gave a single, small nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. But it was acknowledgement. It was a beginning. The seasons turned. Autumn bled into a harsh winter, which eventually gave way to the tentative green of spring. The silence in Blackwood Manor slowly changed its character. It was no longer the heavy silence of absence, but the comfortable silence of shared space. They began to dine together in the smaller, less formal morning room. He would read his papers. She would study her botanical texts. Sometimes a sentence or two would pass between them, an observation about the weather, a piece of political news. Each exchange was a fragile bridge, carefully built and tested. One evening in late summer, he found her in the restored glasshouse. It was no longer a hospital for dying things. It was a riot of life, a humid, fragrant jungle of thriving orchids, their blossoms a cascade of impossible colors. She was standing before a particularly spectacular bloom, a deep, velvety purple he had never seen before. "It is a Paphiopedilum," she said, without turning around. They are notoriously difficult. They require perfect conditions to flower. "You have provided them," he said, standing beside her. She turned to him then, and the smile that touched her lips was small, but it was genuine. It reached her eyes, turning their winter sea gray into the soft, hopeful color of a spring sky after a storm. "It seems we have," she said. It was in that moment that he finally spoke the words that mattered, the words that superseded every contract and transaction that had come before. "I love you, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet but certain in the warm, fragrant air. "I know I have no right, but I do." She did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze searching his, and he let her look, let her see the truth of it in his eyes. He had learned to be still, to wait. "The tenants are grateful, Your Grace." The voice of Mr. Hobbs cut through the late afternoon sun, which slanted across the Duke's desk. A year had passed since the day of the letter. It was autumn once more. Alistair looked up from the report he was reading, a report Eleanor had co-authored, detailing a plan for a small school for the estate children. "Grateful for what, specifically, Hobbs?" "For the Duchess," the old man said simply. "The rents were adjusted for those whose harvests were poor. The cottages by the river have new roofs. The baker's boy can now write his own name. These are not small things." Hobbs cleared his throat, a sound of nervous formality. "They have made a request. For the harvest festival next week, they wish to name it, with your permission, of course." "And what do they wish to name it?" Alistair asked, though he suspected he already knew. "They wish to call it the Duchess's Bounty." The Duchess's Bounty. The words resonated in the quiet study, a perfect, resounding chord that silenced the last, lingering echo of his own foolish pronouncement from a year ago. He had predicted she would wilt. Instead, she had bloomed so profusely that a whole community was now thriving in her shade, celebrating her abundance. He found her, as he so often did now, in the glasshouse. She was wearing a simple blue dress, the color of a cornflower, and the humid air had teased a few strands of honey-colored hair from their pins. She was talking softly to a plant, her fingers stroking a broad, green leaf. She turned as he entered, a real smile gracing her features, a smile that was now reserved for him alone. He did not tell her immediately about the tenant's request. Instead, he walked over to her and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. "Do you remember what I wrote?" he asked quietly. "What I said about you?" A shadow passed briefly over her eyes, but it did not linger. "I remember," she said. "I was wrong," he said, for what felt like the 100th time. But now, the words were not a desperate apology, but a statement of profound, joyful fact. "You did not wilt. You took root in the stoniest ground imaginable, my own ignorance, and you cultivated a garden." He looked around the thriving, vibrant glasshouse, and then back at her. "I was the one who was barren, not you." He then told her about the harvest festival. As he spoke, he saw a flush rise in her cheeks, and her eyes, those beautiful winter sea eyes, shone with a light he had never seen before. It was not just happiness, it was recognition. The quiet, invisible work of her heart and mind, made visible and celebrated by the very people she had sought to help. On the day of the festival, the entire estate gathered on the great lawn before the manor. Banners, hand-painted and charmingly rustic, proclaimed it the Duchess's Bounty. Tables groaned with the weight of pies and breads, fruits and roasted meats. Children with painted faces chased each other through the grass. Alistair stood with Eleanor on the manor steps, looking out over the scene. She was wearing a gown of deep green velvet, the color of moss in a deep forest, and she had woven a few late-blooming jasmine vines into her hair. She was no longer a creature of shadow. She was vibrant, alive, the undisputed center of the world she had so carefully and quietly remade. A delegation of tenants, led by the baker whose son could now read, approached them. The baker held out a clumsily woven crown of wheat and autumn flowers. "For her grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Alistair took the crown and, with a reverence that felt like a prayer, placed it on his wife's head. She looked at him, her eyes bright, and in that moment, he understood the true nature of their union. It was not a contract or a transaction. It was a harvest, a hard-won, miraculous harvest, born of a long, difficult season of learning to see. He had thought he was acquiring a duchess. He had, instead, been gifted a life. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would spend the rest of his days tending to the garden of her heart.